Okay, in this session we are moving into Revelation chapter 5, and really Revelation 4 and 5 go together as a unit. They are in fact one scene from the heavenly throne room. John's taken into heaven. He encounters the presence of God, the Holy One, the glorious one, the gracious one, and Revelation 5 comes out of that and continues the same story. So you have to take these two chapters as a single unit in the book. Let's read Revelation 5. Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat upon the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center before the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's holy people. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God members of every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth." Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice they were saying, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise." Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them, saying, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever." The 4 living creatures said, "Amen," and the elders fell down and worshipped. Now, think of a simple question as we kick off here. Who is Jesus? What's your perception of Jesus? Everyone's got their own perception of him. Everyone gravitates to particular ideas about Jesus. Some people prefer the Jesus in the manger, the sweet little baby Jesus, couldn't hurt a fly, lying in the manger, lying on some hay. That's the kind of Jesus some people like. Others prefer maybe a more mythical Jesus, the Jesus of stained glass windows, the Jesus of history and the great religions and cathedrals, the Jesus who seems to levitate 5 inches above the ground and isn't really quite human. Some people prefer to think of Jesus as a political revolutionary who they can co-opt for particular agendas. Others prefer to think of him as a wise teacher, a sage, a dispenser of timeless proverbs and good sayings. Others see him as a mystical prophet, a fiery prophet proclaiming judgment. And when people come to Revelation, they tend to have a particular perception of Jesus too. A lot of people come to Revelation, they come to this last book in the Bible right at the end, and they think Jesus kind of takes on this persona in Revelation of the warrior. Suddenly Jesus is this conquering hero coming to beat up the bad guys, vanquish all of God's enemies, do away with evil. He's coming to destroy. We have quite a hostile image of Jesus in Revelation, quite an aggressive image that Jesus is this valiant warrior, this conquering crusader who is bent on destruction. One well-known Christian author and speaker puts his view this way. He says, in Revelation, Jesus is a prize fighter with a tattoo down his leg, a sword in his hand, and the commitment to make someone bleed. Now, I don't know how you respond to that. I personally find that a bit troubling for several reasons, one of which is Revelation 5. Because this chapter gives us the central picture of Jesus in the whole book of Revelation. If you want to know who Jesus is in this story of Revelation, you have to center yourself around Revelation 5. It's the clearest glimpse we get. It's the central image from which so much else flows. And before we get into all the other stuff and these disturbing images of judgment and wrath and damnation, we need to anchor ourselves in this picture of Jesus in Revelation 5. It tells us so much about who he is. So it's portrayed here as a story. John's seeing the presence of God, the Holy One, the Glorious One. And then he notices that God is holding in his hand a scroll. And the scroll is sealed. It's sealed shut with 7 seals on it. Now, it's not until a couple of chapters later that we find out fully what this scroll is all about and what's written in it. But it's helpful to hear it now, to see it now, and then this will unfold a little bit as we go. So the best, simplest way to think about the scroll is that it contains God's redemptive plan for the world. There's various ways we could say that. It contains God's plan to establish his kingdom. It contains God's plan to bring his reign into the chaos of sin. God's plan to establish shalom, or peace, upon the earth. To bring the new Jerusalem, as it's described in Revelation, in the midst of this sinful, rebellious world. This is not just something God's planning to do in the end times. This scroll contains God's redemptive plan for history, to take this rebellious, sinful world and bring into it his kingdom and his reign. And this will necessarily involve both judgment and blessing. And we'll see both of these things unfold as Revelation progresses. So we'll come back to the 7 seals and so on later, because they come through chapter 6 and so on. But for now, we see the Father holding this scroll in his hand. And what ensues after this is a huge search for someone to open the scroll, because no one's found. Who can open it? Who can set in motion this plan? Who has the authority to actually begin this redemptive plan of God? There's a great search and nobody's found, and John is distraught by this and starts to weep. One of the elders turns to him and says, "Don't weep. There's no need for weeping, because one has been found who is worthy to open the scroll." In other words, there is one who can set in motion God's plan. There is one who can enact this plan of redemption and salvation and indeed judgment. And as we know, this person is Jesus. Now, what's absolutely critical here to understanding this image of Jesus is to notice the difference between what John hears about Jesus and what he sees of Jesus. First, what he hears. In verse 5, the elder says to him, "See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah." Now, that's a strong image. It's this Old Testament image of a warrior who would come from the tribe of Judah, and he would emerge as a great military leader. He'd crush Israel's enemies. He'd re-establish Israel's supremacy and might as a superpower, and he would ensure that nobody tried to wage war again upon Israel and upon God. He would be a great military warrior on behalf of Israel. It's one of these dominant, strong, harsh images of salvation in the Old Testament. So John hears that that's who's going to open the scroll. He's going to be the Lion of Judah. Not only that, he will also be of the root of David. Now, this is a royal image. It's a king image. God promised that he would establish someone on David's throne who would take over his kingdom and establish an everlasting kingdom, one that would reign forever and ever. This would be God's anointed king. God himself would appoint this person, and their kingdom would have no end. So what John's hearing is this image of warrior and king. These are images full of strength, full of victory, full of conquest, full of triumph. And you can imagine, after hearing these images, what's John expecting to see? This valiant warrior, probably riding on a horse with a sword in his hand, a conquering, crusading hero. That's what's being set up. But look at the difference between that and what he actually sees. Verse 6. "Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing in the center before the throne." John hears of strength. He hears of victory. He hears of conquest, and he sees a lamb. Absolute opposite. He sees this helpless animal. He sees an animal of weakness, powerlessness, fragility. And not just a lamb, he sees a slain lamb, a lamb slaughtered. He sees an image of suffering, an image of death, ultimate weakness. Now, how do you hold these two things together? They're both somehow descriptions of Jesus, what John has heard and what John has seen. Neither one is incorrect, but they just seem so opposite And there must have been such a disconnect, at least for a time, in John's mind as he struggled to reconcile this. There must have been some serious cognitive dissonance going on. Well, this image of the slain lamb takes us all the way back to Exodus. All the way back, in fact, to the night when Israel was rescued from slavery and captivity in Egypt. It was a dramatic night, and God had sent several plagues upon Egypt and upon Pharaoh and his people in particular. And finally God says, here's the last plague that I'm going to bring. The angel of the Lord will pass over the nation of Egypt, and he will strike dead the firstborn child of every household, from the slave right through to Pharaoh himself, the leader of the Egyptian dynasty. And God says through Moses, he says, now each Israelite family, you're to take a lamb, slaughter the lamb, and sprinkle some of the blood over your door frames of your houses. And then as the angel of the Lord passes over, he will see this blood, and he will pass by that house. He will not strike the firstborn child of that family. Sure enough, the angel of the Lord does this, and he strikes dead each firstborn child from among Egypt, but he preserves and saves the families of the Jews that had this blood of the lamb over the door frames of their houses. And in the middle of the night, a great cry goes up from among Egypt as mothers and fathers wake up to find their children dead. It's an awful thing. Even Pharaoh himself, his firstborn son, struck dead. And that for him is the last straw. He says then to Moses, get out. Take these people and go. And it's that really begins their escape. And the Exodus story continues from there. It was such a dramatic night, such a dramatic event, that God enshrined it in law and said, I want you to remember this every year through this feast of Passover. Every year, Jewish families, right to this day, they take a lamb, the lamb is slaughtered, and a feast is prepared through which they commemorate the whole Exodus event and that hasty departure from Egypt that night. Now, the Passover was celebrated in Jesus' day. It was going on, and Jesus would have shared Passover with his disciples on numerous occasions. And John, who wrote Revelation, also wrote a gospel. He also wrote this biography of Jesus. And when John comes to record the death of Jesus, and remember, he's doing this probably after he's written Revelation. So he's had this throne room experience. And then he comes later on to write his biography of Jesus. When he comes to write the crucifixion account, he does something that no other gospel writer does. In John 19, John mentions twice that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation for Passover. In other words, the day the lambs are slain. You don't slaughter the lambs on Passover itself. You slaughter them the day before. So within Israel, within Jerusalem in particular, lambs were being slaughtered all over the place on the very day that Jesus dies. John wants to make an explicit connection here in our minds. He wants us to understand Jesus is the lamb. He is the Passover lamb. God's not using an animal anymore to bring about liberation. He's not bringing an animal to bring about rescue. He's using Jesus. Jesus has become the lamb. Jesus has become weakened. Jesus has become vulnerable. He's become frail and fragile. He's been dehumanized and debased, utterly humiliated, scourged, whipped, flogged, and hung on a cross. He has entered into this profound state of weakness, and he has done it all out of an incredible self-giving love for us. All out of a selfless desire to give life to us. That's the heart of this image. And from the cross, from that position of total weakness and humiliation, Jesus brings about triumph. That's why the elder says to John, look, the Lion of Judah, the root of David, he has triumphed. Well, indeed he has. That's not a lie. Jesus has triumphed, but he's triumphed from the cross. He's triumphed from this position of weakness. Jesus has won a victory over sin, over all the power of sin. He's won a victory over Satan, the one who holds the keys to death and Hades. Jesus robbed him of the keys. So he says himself in Revelation 1, now I hold the keys to death and Hades. He's beaten down the strong man and taken his power. Jesus has won this decisive victory over all the forces of evil in the heavenly realms, the principalities and powers, forces of evil in the earthly realms, and he's done it all from a cross outside the city of Jerusalem. You see, it's not that Jesus sometimes is a warrior and a king, and then other times is a slain lamb. He's both all the time. Jesus is a warrior, and his sword is a cross. Jesus is a king, and his crown is made of thorns. Those images must sit together, even though they're uncomfortable for us, and they create this tension. Jesus is the warrior king who is also the slain lamb. He is the lion and the lamb at the same time. John just brings this together beautifully in this description of Jesus. The lamb standing but slaughtered. It's never that Jesus gives up his power. Jesus has 7 horns on his head, which is unusual, of course, for a lamb. But Jesus has these horns, and horns illustrate power. Jesus has power. He holds on to his power. He has complete and utter authority that never changes. But the question is, how does Jesus use his power? How does Jesus use this great authority he has? And the answer is that he summons all of his power and all of his strength to exercise self-giving love. That's the nature of the Lamb. That's the nature of our Messiah. You could call this lamb power. That's the type of power Jesus exercises throughout Revelation, and it's especially demonstrated here in chapter 5. Lamb power is the total opposite of Rome power. Rome power was power at the end of a sword. It was power through coercion, through bullying, violence, oppression, and force. Lamb power is categorically different to that. Lamb power is not using force. It's not controlling and manipulating. Jesus doesn't use his power to bully us and to oppress us. He uses his power to love us. He uses his strength and his power to show us the depths of his love for us, even though that means being weakened in the process. He's willing to do it. He's willing to empty himself, to pour himself out and to be completely humbled in order that we might have life and we might receive blessing and we might be raised up. He takes the dying in order that we might receive a rising to new life. His power is power in powerlessness. It's strength in the midst of weakness. It's honor in the midst of shame. It's wisdom in the midst of foolishness. It's the paradox at the heart of Jesus. And we could push it further and say it's the paradox at the heart of God. Because doesn't Jesus show us who God is? You can't play the Father and the Son off against each other in these images. The Son is the Father and the Father is the Son. They share the throne. So if Jesus demonstrates this profound lamb power, this self-giving, self-lowering, self-emptying love, then doesn't this lead us to conclude that God himself demonstrates the same nature, demonstrates the same essence? He's the Holy One, he's the glorious one, but he's also the loving, self-giving one, whose very heart and nature is this incredibly lavish and generous love that is willing to give all of itself away for the sake of his creatures, us. What does it mean then for us as we worship this Lamb, as we worship the slain Lamb, the Lamb power? What does it mean for us to be conformed to the image of the Lamb in our lives? Because that's part of our worship. It's not just singing songs to Jesus and praying prayers to Jesus and taking communion to remember Jesus. It's also us being conformed to the image of this Lamb, slain but standing. How do we demonstrate in our own lives this kind of Lamb power? Because it's not just the source of our salvation, it's the model of our Christian discipleship. Well, I think a wonderful example of Lamb power came out in the news this week, this lovely story of Tevita Nalu, the New Zealand weightlifter. He was competing in the Oceania Champs for an Olympic nomination over in Samoa. Weightlifting's an individual sport, of course, but it also works collectively in the sense that the team needs enough points collectively to be able to win the title, and then whichever team out of the Oceania nations wins the title, they send their top-ranked contestant to the Olympics in London. And so Nalu was named in the squad for New Zealand, but then in training on Monday night, he tore a quad muscle. So basically, he was out of any chance of getting his own name put forward for the Olympics, but it also meant that because he was out, the team wasn't going to get his points. And that meant New Zealand really had no chance. The men's team had no chance of getting an Olympic nomination. They weren't going to beat the other nations. And Nalu says all night after that injury, he spent thinking of his team. Not his own injury, not his pain, but thinking of his team. And he decided the next day that he was going to make an attempt, that he was going to try, with nothing to gain, with no hope of an Olympic nomination individually, but for the sake of his teammates, in particular for the sake of Richard Patterson, who had won the men's title, and so was New Zealand's contender if he could get the nomination. And so Tevita took to the platform on his teammates' behalf, and in unbelievable pain, and basically on one leg, as I understand it, he made a lift and managed 123 kgs. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to get New Zealand where they needed to be to take the title. And in the process of making that lift, he did further tearing to his quad muscle. So the doctor told him to stop at that point. He was in bad shape. But he was so committed to his teammates that he decided to make one more go of it. And he gets up on the platform, and you just imagine the pain must have been just searing. He attempts a final lift, and he managed 157 kgs. It wasn't enough to give him a medal at the Oceania Champs, but it took New Zealand to a place of taking out the men's title, which means that Richard Patterson got his Olympic nomination, and he'll be there in London. And when Richard Patterson gets up on that platform in London, he will be there because of the good grace of his teammate Tevita Nalu, who made this incredible sacrifice to his own detriment, physically, in order to have his teammate there. Now, on one level, that's a nice human interest story, and it's a good, heartwarming tale. But as I did a bit of poking around, it also seems like Tevita Nalu is a committed Christian, a genuine Christian man. And if that's true, it changes the story entirely. Because now this is not just something he did as a nice moral act. Now this is coming from a faith commitment to Jesus. And if it is, then I don't know whether he'd say it this way, but Tevita Nalu demonstrated in that act lamb power, strength and weakness, and self-giving love for the sake of the other. A willingness to be weakened, a willingness to be poured out and spent, so that as he himself said after that lift, I had nothing left to give. He had been utterly spent, but spent on behalf of the other, his teammate, in order to give blessing and in order to give life. That's lamb power. Now that's a dramatic example, and it's not going to look that dramatic, of course, in our lives. We're not called to weightlift 157 kgs, but it's just a case of thinking through in the ordinariness and the everyday life. What does this look like? What is lamb power? What does it mean for me to be conformed to the image of the slain lamb, to embody this lamb power in my life? Maybe it means that if you're waiting for a car park and someone else comes after you and signals in for the same car park, rather than getting angry about it and showing a bit of road rage, you wave them in. Even if it means you have to park a couple of rows back and walk, and it takes more time. You are prepared to be slain in some small, minuscule sense for the sake of loving and blessing someone else. Maybe it means that if you're having an argument with your spouse, even though you've got all the facts on your side, obviously, as you always do, even if you've got all the arguments and you've got all the evidence and circumstances clearly support your point of view, maybe it means that you are prepared to say, because this means something to you, I'm prepared to give up the ground. I'm prepared to give up this entrenched position of mine. I want to see it from your perspective. I want to understand it, and let's see if we can work this out in a way that has meaning and value for you. And you acquiesce for the sake of the other. It's lamb power. It's your willingness in some sense to be slain, to be misunderstood perhaps, to give up a position you hold, so that someone else might receive blessing and life. Maybe it means at work that you let someone know that you're a follower of Jesus. That when you go to work tomorrow and someone asks you, what did you do at the weekend? The first thing you say is not that you went to the rugby on Saturday night, but that you went to church on Sunday morning. And you wait there for the glazed stare and the confused look and the awkward silence and the conversation change that inevitably follows that. But you're prepared for that, for a bit of humiliation and a bit of awkwardness, for the sake of sowing a seed and being a witness and saying a word and doing something that God may use to eventually bring life for another person. It's looking for these small ways. Maybe it's moving towards someone else that you normally wouldn't want to spend time with love and with grace, talking to someone after church that you wouldn't normally, out of your own little conversation circle, in order to bless them. Maybe that means being slain in the sense of not having the normal person to talk to because you're over here. But we take that burden and we carry that burden because we want to be like Jesus and bless others. And this is happening. Within our own church community, people are doing these things. I've heard stories just this week of families, of individuals making sacrifices, financial sacrifices for the sake of others, offering hospitality selflessly for the sake of others. Talking to a guy this morning who's taking a day of annual leave to come and spend some time in the church in ministry. These kinds of things. In every case, someone's choosing a type of death in order to give someone else a type of life. Someone's choosing to be weakened. Someone's choosing to be wounded in some way. Some ways small, some ways a greater cost. But there's always weakness in order to breathe life into someone else. They're choosing to take the dying end of the equation so that someone else can take the rising. And in doing so, they are exhibiting lamb power.
This has been a teaching message from Shore Community Church. For more of our teaching resources, or to donate to our teaching resource ministry, or for more information on Shore Community Church, visit www.shore.org.nz. Alternatively, you can email office@shore.org.nz or phone 09 415 0455. Thank you for listening.